Thanks for joining us inside the Dancer's Studio, where we bring listeners like you closer to the creative process. Inside the Dancer's Studio is a program of the National Center for Choreography at the University of Akron, as part of our Ideas in Motion initiative. This episode was recorded in the presence of a virtual audience in spring of 2021. Today we join Christy Bolingbroke, our Executive Artistic Director, in conversation with Champaign-Urbana, Illinois-based choreographer and educator, Abby Zbikowski. Abby is the founder of the company Abby Z and the New Utility. Abby is a 2020 United States Artists Fellow and received a 2017 Juried Bessie Award for her work. She is also a professor of dance at the University of Illinois and on faculty at the American Dance Festival.
How or when did you know you wanted to be a choreographer? Can you pinpoint a moment?
Well, I think I was reviewing these questions as I was trying to get back in. And I think my question came up of what kind of choreographer? Is there an assumption of what, because I think I went through different stages of what that means and where that occupation would bring me or in front of who. I remember the first dance that I choreographed, I was in the first grade in my bedroom to Whitney Houston's How Will I Know? And I think I did 400 pivot step turns in it. There was just something that I've always had a lot of kinetic energy, and I grew up in an environment where it wasn't so weird to express yourself through movement, right? So it wasn't a low energy household, whether it was going to be through sports or, I'm 100% Polish, and my mom was basically a fly girl for polka bands in the 70s. When she's from upstate New York, it would follow different polka bands, and her and my aunt would have the, traditional Polish garb, but white patent leather go-go boots with it. So it's yes, dance, being a choreographer, it was just this innate, movement was innate and putting it together. But actually knowing beyond it being this space where it could bring communities together or entertain, on a more, and I hate doing the high-low art divide, but in a way, I wasn't really familiar with staged dances, choreographed, modern dance or ballet or anything like that. Most of my exposure had been through my mom, these Polish picnics or music videos, the MTV generation. I wanted to be Tina Landon, who was Janet Jackson's choreographer for her, Janet album. And, these things where it was just all this information still feels really relevant to how I see dance being able to hold space and operate and kind of draw in, show its value from a lot of different demographic perspectives, as somebody honoring and knowing that it's it's not everybody is versed in the history of modernism and postmodernism and, conceptual art in a way, but that stuff is also not completely not related to these references that I'm speaking about. So young. And honestly, I think because I am such a mix of so many different, trainings, ways of being, ways I carry myself, I didn't really see a clear-cut place for me in a company when I was growing up, So again, it was how do I build a space for people with not identical, situations to mine, but also are in this in-between zone.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I mean, there's so much in all of that. That I love because it really crosses a spectrum of your experiences as a human being, as opposed to saying, I'm going to be a choreographer and then building an idea from the top down. But rather you're I'm an amalgamation of all of these different experiences and ideas, almost anthropological when I think about the Polish picnics and also Janet Jackson videos and Whitney Houston. I think I had the same dance also in elementary school. Yeah. But I'm curious now, where do you start? Like, what inspires an idea for a new work?
So I feel like, and you and I have had this conversation in the past, I think I have a very ambitious and like big scope of how I think about dance and want to present it, because I want it to kind of be the centerpiece for a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily come together and care about something or talk about something or be even in the same room with this piece of art or offering. So I feel like every time I'm starting a new piece, I'm like revamping or like deepening just a whole artistic statement or mission, because pieces don't become like the whatever. I'll steal one of my mentors' phrases of like the aboutness is like it's not going to be literally present in terms of like a narrative inside the thing. It's going to be intentionally layered with all of these different points that have a lot of, that are, yes, it's me kind of sculpting and contextualizing my perspective and experience, but really working collaboratively with the movers that I work with and drawing from what they know, their bodies of knowledge, their particular eccentricities, and, it's not, even though I have like, and I'll talk about myself, I have a very, I'll be open that it's like, I have a very atypical dance training background, but that's also, so do a lot of people. And I think there's a lot of people who are struggling to kind of like, where can I articulate all these complex and nuanced ideas in a way? Where can I try them out? Where can I, where can we think like about not just about where we've been, but where we can go because of where we've been, how we're conditioned or how we're organized as a result of our environments and all these things, whether or not it's this environment that we grew up in and didn't have a choice, or it's this thing that we elected to do. What has that set us up to be able to do, and what does that mean? So I think it's all of those things. It's like just kind of fine-tuning my language and fine-tuning like reference points that I'm feeling particularly like inspired by or into in the moment.
Do you want to name the mentor who introduced the idea
Miller.
of
BB, who
aboutness?
At grad, she's been a huge, influence in the way that I see things, and not kind of a letting go of things needing to literally be about something in a very direct and theatrical way, but was a real kind of like opening a door to like, oh, there's so much more space. But I just, again, I came from I went to Temple for undergrad. I was in Philadelphia, and I was exposed, like being in college, like that was really the first time I was exposed to dance works on stage. And a lot of them were heavily like dance theater works, which is fine, but it wasn't necessarily the vehicle for the ideas I was having, Yeah. So it's just like knowing all these different kind of operational methods of like how work can come to mean stuff and live in the world. It's all relevant. It's all good. It's just like, how can you be more intentional about what's going to support what you're doing?
Yeah. There's kind of two things going on. There's the creative process when you're navigating an idea, you're making sort of sense or processing, the amalgamation of experiences you've referenced. But then there's also, how are you navigating the field, right? When you see something, and I so appreciate and want to lift up your statement about, you're like, I looked around at these companies and I was like, that's not me. So to carve out your own path as well. And a lot of times people can get swept up by what they see, trends. Oh my gosh, everyone's talking. I need to use that. But
I have to say, I think a lot of those companies probably would have looked at me and said, we're not for you. Like, I think that the reverse probably would have been very much in play.
I think it goes both ways. Yeah. And I think that's great too, because you don't have to convince someone to work with you either. Right. Similar to sort of trends that happen, I'm curious about how you would choreograph or characterize your relationship to sound. You don't make dances, at least not in recent history, to Whitney Houston anymore.
No.
So,
No.
And a lot of silence, actually,
Right.
or natural sounds.
There's a lot of Whitney Houston that plays in the background of rehearsals. Like,
Nice.
because rehearsals are this, like, you know, they're this communal training space where people are experimenting, and, you know, the music can kind of act as a shield between people. So it's like, okay, there's this buffer between me and the dancers who are kind of going into themselves and working on, you know, this really particular body patterning that's like new, you know, that takes like a certain level of concentration. But okay, so the relationship to sound is that I know I organize around rhythm, like in my body. I'll understand, or I'll have this kind of impulse, or an innate understanding of a rhythm I'm trying to work out, and how it's related to, you know, I started off as I wanted to be a tapper, like a tap dancer, right? And so tap dance is really having a renaissance right now on, you know, in terms of like experimental dance or concert dance. But that was really like my love, was this kind of like sense of like, and then more of like a down and dirty, like hoofing kind of, this thing that's really felt and can be really soothing because it's felt. But there's a musicality in that. And so, you know, a lot of my training has been in the African diasporic forms. So on top of like wanting to tap, you know, I grew up outside of Philly, and I would take in this was like the late 90s, early 2000s, I would take the train into Philly, and I would take a lot of workshops and classes from Rennie Harris Pure Movement dancers, because this was like right when hip hop was actually starting to be offered in a dance studio. And so it was like that, and then also taking like, you know, West African classes. All this was at Koresh Dance Center, which is still in existence. So yeah, like there's a lot of through line, obviously, in terms of rhythm and letting the body speak, and then like rhythms also kind of holding certain associations. So I am interested in that, again, going back to that like anthropological or ethnomusicology aspect of it, where it's like there's something stripped down and very punk and utility about what is going on, but there's also these flavors of these like of these rhythms that are really carrying the bodies and organizing space and time.
There, you know, this series is a part of what we call it at NCCAkron, our Ideas in Motion and 21st Century Dance Practices. And I feel you've alluded to this a little bit, but maybe we could underline that. You know, when you talk about your training being atypical, and really embracing that a lot of today's dancers and artists have atypical training. That's something I would offer back, is sort of the difference between 20th century thinking and 21st century thinking and operations.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what it is that you do look for in dancers and collaborators?
So, well, people who want to consistently show up. You know, for a long time, nobody really knew or understood what I was doing, because it kind of looked and felt and seemed so different. And because of the nature of like, it is very body centric, movement centric. So it's exhausting, and that can take that does a lot. You need to be able to like protect yourself in that, and be able to come back the next day. So I do look for people who, not like, people who follow me and take my class, but people who have a genuine interest and do show up, and not in a way, because there's no way to show off in this material and do it correctly, because there is something really sort of interior driving it. So you can't fake it. So like, that's the thing. So people who know that it's not easy and keep coming back, like there is a characteristic about that kind of person that is of interest to me, because that's a technique too, like the sort of the mental navigation and all of that. Somebody, I don't necessarily care what your base training is, but people who are open to kind of like not knowing, people who are open to like not being an expert inside the thing. And again, that's like, it's mental and physical.
Yeah.
But a lot of people, you know, there are people who it might seem like they have an easier time in rehearsals, like people who've been with me for a long time, because typically if you have that sort of that sense of because a lot of what I will offer in terms of, I'll work collaboratively, but in terms of what I offer physically will be very specifically rhythmic and dynamic. So having done forms in any capacity that has an emphasis on that is, you usually find helpful. Yeah.
And I want to riff off of a little bit too. You said it's not, you can't show off inside of this material.
Yeah.
But one of the other sort of shifting, I think, ideas in dance between 20th century thinking and 21st century dance is definitions of virtuosity. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious because I some of my first introductions to your work, I have sat in the round and watched fellow audience members just sit mouths agape for 45 minutes, right? They're just like, what? So how do you define or navigate virtuosity, either as something that you're trying to move away from, or how and when you might embrace it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, like, what is virtuosity? It's not the same to everybody, and it's not always on the surface. It doesn't live on the surface. It's not about having the hardest hit. You know, it's about having the most clearly embodied intention that then extends beyond the body. Like, it's all about scale. And in terms of like what the actual physical work is, choreographically, I'm not interested in everything being on the same scale of like just, you know, all the time, but finding actually just like, you know, there's a real virtuosity in not taking it to the expected end point and veering off to the left and turning it on its head. You know, that's a virtuosity in itself that's being invented as we're rehearsing it into existence. So inventing new forms of virtuosity. Virtuosity exists everywhere in everyday labor and physicality. And I think it also goes back to like, I think I might even be conflating notions of technique and virtuosity in what I'm talking about right now. But I think that efficiency in technique, it doesn't have to look the same for everybody, but it's like, you know it when you see it, you know? And there's something really deeply felt and understood and like kind of rings out on this other level when it's in action. So I also think, like, for me, the unexpected virtuosity, and not just to be like, this will really give them thrills, but like unexpectedness also in the process of finding what it is when working collaboratively with dancers.
I love hearing you describe that because, you know, I watched a lot of dance too. And sometimes when you're like, oh, here come the fouette turns, or here come, you know, jump splits, or the sort of like backflips and the tricks. But what you described so much was the context around those things. Yeah. Right? Especially if you can surprise people, as opposed to seeing someone like rush all the way to stage right so they have enough room to do that backflip. That's not unexpected. Yeah. And that sort of next level nuance is really fascinating. And also the idea of efficiency, because we know that is what I think dancers do, is they make it look easy. So how do you also show the humanness or the labor? Because we know this is not easy. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's like I think dancers find in the work, especially like evening length works, where it's like they find that spot where it's like, okay, my showing of the labor in this moment is like gratuitous and not necessary. So it's like really kind of finding that, okay, how can actually showing the labor, it's not an act, how can this support me withstand it? So it's nothing's being put on, it's a byproduct of. But there are certain ways of like breathing that aren't very like dramatic, well, that are dramatic, but not like this idea of like shorter inhales and longer exhales in order to like get your anxiousness and your breath back together. Like that doesn't read drama in the same way as like does, but it's a tactic. So it's like actually like what is the functionality of these tactics of expressing like what's going to create the efficiency? Because there is a lot of like, you can see the body working, but what are the things that are going to actually help it?
Some of our friends tuning in reflect the fact that there's an honesty that comes up in your work. And we also have a question. Rory is interested if any of your works have ended up being nothing like you originally set them out to be.
Yeah. I think that's my friend Rory from San Francisco.
We have people from Taipei, from Denton, Texas.
Yeah.
Yes, we're global.
Yes. Yeah, all of the work ends up not from my brain, you know, I see the difference, right? So a lot of my work will have, you know, a driving physicality and emphasis on rhythm, all of that. But I will see kind of how these elements are being utilized differently, and it might register on a different scale. But for me, I'll find, you know, it's that process of if I'm not interested in the things that we already know how to do so much. It's that, what is the new application? What is the new utility? Like, what is, you know, and that name, I know it's like, is people question the name or they feel funny, but it's like
the name of your company.
Utility.
Yeah.
But also it's kind of like somebody had mentioned the other day, they're like, oh, that sounds like a Prince backup band. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. Like, that's exactly right. Like, I wanted to kind of hold that space of like, it's conceptual, but it's also a Prince backup band name.
Nice.
But it's not so I'll see it as not being exactly what I had envisioned. And to be honest, I feel like the most successful works I've had started from a point where I didn't have to write about them or talk about them first. Because words are limiting and confining. So I think these processes where I've been able to just, you know, have that urge to like in the body to kind of just start digging around with something and playing with people have been the most successful. But I don't 100% know the outcome. And I also know that like, yeah, the work is never done. The product is never, you know, no one's ever satisfied. It's not about like, satisfaction. It's like, okay, is this fully realized? And it takes a long time for things to become fully realized, especially like evening length stuff, because it's grueling. Yeah.
Well, even thinking, you know, that your dance making is a form of research. And so I think about, you know, any other academic colleagues who also grapple with an idea. They're doing that research, they're testing it out. How do you continue to show up if you find yourself in a rut, or it's just, you know, like moving through molasses, and yet you're working against a deadline, or that's when you have access to rehearsal space? Do you have any sort of creative tools that allow you to push through those moments?
Yeah, I think now, like in the pandemic, it's allowed me to see what they are more than when I am, because I had been going so full throttle, because I live in Illinois, I was working in New York, like so much back and forth, and I had this velocity, go. And something about the last piece I was working on, there's a lot of good ideas, but there wasn't enough space around the ideas. And I couldn't see that because my own BPM was like here, like it was off the charts all the time. So I was calibrated to this whole other degree of speed and intensity that is like, oh, actually, if we were to like walk it down, and then like now I could see, oh, I needed to create more space in order to show. It's like, it's the in-between, even the in-between actions, that there's potential in these moments of not just nailing the thing and moving on, But like I even see in my technique classes, it's like the technique is in the transition. How are you going from one thing to the next? What is the evolution of this idea in the body, whether it's rhythmic or spatial or about your weight or about whatever it's about? What is it? What's like the story you're telling? What's the star of the show? So, yeah. Did I answer your question? I'm sorry.
No, you totally did. I love that idea of realizing that you didn't have enough space around an idea. Yeah. Right? Like, that's anytime you're in a process or trying to be creative or to force it, it needs still some room to breathe. And that may look different for a lot of people. In the spirit of recognizing that and acknowledging our time, I'll pivot to our last question, which is to invite you to share either some of your own advice or the best piece of advice that you've ever received in navigating a creative life.
This came from Susan Hadley, who taught, Mark Morris, so you know Susan Hadley. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was a professor at Ohio State when I was there for my grad degree, and she said something in a comp class, and it translates to so many things in life, but it's like, just do more of the thing you're doing. Like, there's always so much advice that is like, consider this, consider da-da-da-da-da, that derails a lot of these like people actually going a little bit more head first in a direction that is less easy to articulate or less identifiable upfront, right? So it's like, so in that saying alone, I'm like, oh, okay, so like, take a risk, don't shy away, don't be afraid to be different. And for me, it's like I come in and out of being like considered cool or not cool. I'm like totally weird, so cool or not cool is irrelevant to me. So it's just like, how can you like also like stay in your lane, even if people have a lot of action and things going on? Like, how do you maintain the integrity of what it is you're doing? I know it's hard to locate that, so it's like, once you can locate that, how can you not be afraid to like live in it a little bit more instead of feel like you have to move on to the next thing? Because it might be like your trajectory might not be about just piece after piece holding a concept or an idea, but it's like you might be driving this other way of looking or seeing or allowing the world to engage with dance and physicality that will manifest and work in different ways. It's like, I'm a really slow worker, and I'm like very self-conscious about that. Like, it takes a long time to know that that's the thing. And yeah, I mean, I feel like after Abandoned Playground, my like first like big, evening like premiere work, Simon Dove gave me the advice. He's like, don't feel pressured to be like, a lot of people are going to come up to you and ask you to like make a piece a year. He's like, don't do it. He's like, I don't see that as being your where your strength will lie. And it's right. It was nice to hear that from an outside source, because it's not like a one-off. I'll do that at universities because it's a different experience working with students in that way and giving them that like, really quick turnaround experience that then there's this manifestation of a piece. But that in like the research with my company outside of that, it's like, pacing. It's a marathon.
Space and space around what you do. Yeah. And I love the clarification that do more of what you're doing doesn't mean in terms of volume or proliferation, that idea of producing once a year, but that sense of self to be able to translate and double down on how you want to work too. And it resonated with some of our friends in the chat too. So they appreciate that. Abby, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for teaching and working with our students and for dropping some knowledge and experience with us today. Have a great Friday. Bye now.
Bye. Thank you.
Inside the Dancers Studio Lunchtime Talk Series is supported by NCCAkron, the University of Akron, the University of Akron Foundation, and the Mary Schiller Myers Lecture Series in the Arts. Our podcast program is produced by Jennifer Edwards. Ellis Rovin is our composer and editor. Transcription by Madeline Greenberg. Theme music by Flaco Torres. Cover art by Micah Krause. And Julian Curate and Kat Wentz are our artist coordinators. To learn more about NCCAkron, please visit us online at nccakron.org or follow us on Instagram or Facebook at NCCAkron. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we encourage you to subscribe on your favorite podcast streaming platform by searching Inside the Dancers Studio. Thank you for listening, and stay curious.